The morning her husband had her served with a restraining order, Vivian was lying on an examination table, 33 weeks pregnant, listening to her daughter's heartbeat on the monitor. The young man didn't even look at her face. He set the envelope on the chair
To
beside
us,
her
Brianna,
and said, "Have a good day."
and to everything
She
we're
read
about
all
to
14
achieve.
pages, in a paper gown, alone. Her husband had called her low maintenance, no ambitions, just easy. He told his colleagues she didn't work. He retitled her car. He forged her signature on a mortgage application. He moved their savings into an account she didn't know existed. And then he filed to have her removed from their home. He had planned every single move. There was just one thing he forgot to plan for. He had no idea, not even a whisper of suspicion after 4 years of marriage, that the quiet woman who ironed his shirts and drove him to the airport and passed the bread basket at dinner parties owned $36 billion. He thought he was burying her. He was planting her. Stay with Vivian today, because what happens next? In that courtroom, 34 weeks pregnant, navy dress, her grandmother's pearls, is the kind of moment that reminds you exactly what a woman is capable of when she finally decides she is done being underestimated. Lesson statement. This story is a reminder that patience is not weakness, silence is not surrender, and the most dangerous thing a woman can be is the thing her enemy has already decided she isn't.
The ultrasound machine hummed. The heartbeat filled the small examination room like a second presence. Steady, strong, a sound that asked nothing and promised everything. Vivian Caldwell Mercer lay on the paper-covered table and stared at the ceiling. The paper gown crinkled every time she breathed. The gel on her belly was cold at first, then warm, and the wand moved slowly, deliberately, across the curve of 33 weeks of her life. Dr. Patricia Hollis tilted the monitor. There she is, 8 pounds projected. She is going to be a big, healthy girl. Vivian looked at the screen, at the curve of a tiny nose, at the miniature fist pressed against a cheek. A fist, already clenched, already braced. She looks like she is ready to fight, Vivian thought. Good. She gets that from me. The room smelled like antiseptic and the faint sweetness of the hand lotion Dr. Hollis used. Outside the window, a truck rumbled past. A phone rang somewhere down the hall and stopped. The heartbeat continued, steady, strong. "Grant couldn't make it today?" Dr. Hollis asked. Her voice was careful, neutral. This was the 3rd appointment he had missed. "He had a meeting," Vivian said. He always had a meeting. Dr. Hollis pressed a few buttons and printed the ultrasound image. She set it on the tray beside the table. "I'll be right back with your results. Rest for a moment." The door clicked shut. Vivian lay in the humming quiet. She listened to her daughter's heartbeat. She put one hand on the side of her belly and felt the small shift of a heel moving against her palm. "I know," she said softly. "I know you're awake." The door opened. She expected the nurse. The nurse always came back first with the printed paperwork. The nurse had red hair and called everyone honey and always asked if Vivian needed water. The person who stepped inside was not the nurse. He was young, maybe 24, gray polo shirt, dark slacks. He held a manila envelope flat against his chest, and he did not look at her face. He looked at the wall to the left of the examination table. He set the envelope on the plastic chair beside her. "Vivian Mercer," he said, to the wall. "Yes, you've been served." He was already backing toward the door. "Have a good day." The door closed. The heartbeat monitor continued. Beep, beep, beep. The envelope sat on the plastic chair, manila. Standard size, her name typed on the label in a plain font. Below her name, a return address she did not recognize. A law firm, downtown. She reached for it. The monitor cable pulled slightly at her wrist. She unclasped it and set it aside. She picked up the envelope. She opened it. The cover page was dense with legal formatting. She read it slowly. Every word. Her eyes were steady. In the matter of Grant Allen Mercer, petitioner, versus Vivienne Rose Caldwell Mercer, respondent. Application for emergency restraining order and temporary protective order. The room was very still. Vivian read the next page, and the next, 14 pages total. She read every single one. The paper gown crinkled. The antiseptic smell was sharp in her nose. Outside, another truck passed. The heartbeat monitor beeped without her attached to it now, a soft and useless rhythm. The allegations were detailed, thorough. Someone had spent time on these: erratic behavior, emotional volatility, threatening language, fear for petitioner's personal safety, his safety. Grant Allen Mercer, 38 years old, 5 feet 11, 190 pounds. Afraid of her, Vivian looked at her belly, at the shape of her daughter on the monitor screen, still frozen on the last image, the tiny fist, the braced cheek. She thought about the morning she had driven Grant to the airport 3 weeks ago. She had woken at 5:30 in the morning to pack his toiletry bag. She had ironed 2 of his shirts. She had made coffee and put it in his travel mug and carried it to the car. She had hugged him at the departures terminal, and he had patted her back twice, the way you pat a dog, and said he would call when he landed. He had not called when he landed. She read the filing date on the cover page. He had filed this 4 days ago. He filed this 4 days ago, and then he came home for dinner, and he sat across from her at the kitchen table, and he talked about a project at work, and he asked if there was more bread, and she got up and got him more bread, and he said thank you without looking up from his phone. She sat with that for a moment. She did not cry. She had known, in the quiet place where honest things live, that something was coming. She had not known it would look like this. But she had known something was coming. All right, she thought. All right then. Dr. Hollis returned. She came through the door with a folder of printed results and stopped when she saw Vivian's face. Not because Vivian was crying, because she was not. Everything okay? Dr. Hollis asked. Her voice had shifted, less clinical. Everything is fine, Vivian said. When is my next appointment? 2 weeks. Dr. Hollis set the folder down slowly. Vivian, is there anything? 2 weeks is perfect, Vivian said. Thank you, Patricia. She folded the 14 pages back into the manila envelope. She tucked the envelope into her purse. She accepted the ultrasound printout from the tray. She looked at her daughter's fist one more time. Then she got dressed. The parking garage was dim and smelled like exhaust and concrete. Vivian walked to her car, a silver sedan, 4 years old, always clean. She unlocked it. She got in. She closed the door. She sat there. She did not start the engine. She held her phone. She put it down on the passenger seat. She picked it up. She put it down. She picked it up again and held it without looking at the screen. A pigeon landed on the concrete barrier in front of her car. It walked in a small circle. It looked at her. It flew away. She watched the space where it had been. Then she started the car. She drove. Not home. Not yet. She thought about what she knew and what Grant did not. Grant believed he had married a woman with no resources, a woman whose modest family trust had helped with the house down payment, a woman who managed the household, kept things running smoothly, showed up beautifully at his firm's holiday parties, and asked no difficult questions about money because he had trained her, carefully and patiently over 4 years, not to. He had told her she was low maintenance. He had said it like a compliment. She had smiled. She had passed the bread. She had been 29 years old and newly in love with a man who made her feel, for the first time in her adult life, like she could simply rest, like she did not have to carry everything alone, like someone else could be in charge for a while. Her grandmother Agnes had warned her, not about Grant specifically. Agnes had never met a man she fully trusted with anything important, but she had warned Vivian about the specific danger of letting someone believe they had power over you. The moment a man knows what you have, Agnes had said, he starts trying to take it. Wait. Be patient. Watch. Vivian had waited. She had been patient. She had watched. She had watched Grant lie and manage and minimize and pat her hand and say, "Don't worry about the money, sweetheart, I'll handle it." She had watched him become, year by year, a man who genuinely believed his own performance, who genuinely believed the woman sitting across from him at dinner was exactly what he had decided she was. She pulled into the long driveway of Dot's house 40 minutes south of the city. The house was white clapboard with a green door, azaleas along the front walk, a wind chime that Agnes had given Dot 30 years ago, still hanging from the porch ceiling, still making its soft sound in the afternoon air. Dot opened the front door before Vivian reached the porch steps. She took one look at her niece. She did not say anything. She held the door open wider, and Vivian walked inside. "Dot," Vivian said. She set her purse on the entry table. She stood in the hallway of the house where she had grown up after her parents died. The house that smelled like lemon polish and old wood and something baking. He filed. A silence. Dot's voice was low and absolutely certain. "I'll call Fletcher." Ice clinked in a glass somewhere down the hall. Vivian heard it from the guest room where she had slept as a child after her parents' accident. The guest room where the wallpaper was pale yellow with small white flowers, and the quilt on the bed had been made by Agnes's mother before Agnes was born. She did not sleep that night. She lay on top of the quilt and stared at the yellow wallpaper, and she thought about a dinner party. It was 2 years ago. Grant's colleague Davis had hosted at his house in the suburbs. A big house, loud kitchen, the kind of party where everyone stood in groups and talked about things that mattered to them and pretended to be interested in what everyone else said. Grant had been in a good mood, relaxed. He put his arm around her shoulders and said to 3 partners from his firm and their wives, "You all know Viv. No drama, no ambitions, just easy." He had laughed when he said it. His colleagues had nodded approvingly. Their wives had smiled the specific smile of women who recognized a particular kind of insult dressed in the clothes of a compliment. Vivian had smiled too. She had reached for the bread basket and passed it around the table. She had been so good at waiting. She was so tired of it. Fletcher Wynne arrived at Dot's house at 7 the next morning. He came in the back door with his own key, the way he had done for 23 years. And he found Vivian and Dot already at the kitchen table with coffee. He was 52 years old, silver at the temples. He wore a dark suit even on a Saturday morning because Fletcher Wynne had never in his adult life dressed for comfort when he could dress for purpose. He carried a single yellow legal pad. He set it on the table. He sat down. He looked at Vivian for a long moment. "How are you?" he asked. "I'm clear," she said. "Tell me what we're doing." He nodded once. He appreciated that about her. He had appreciated it since she was 19 years old, and Agnes had first brought her to his office and said, "This is my granddaughter. She needs to understand everything." He picked up the legal pad. "The emergency restraining order will be heard in 18 days. That is more time than we need. The judge assigned is Harriet Odom. She has been on the family court bench for 14 years. She is not easily impressed, and she does not like wasted time." "Good," Vivian said. Grant's attorney is Nolan Voss. 22 years in family law, competent, not exceptional. He has almost certainly been given an incomplete picture of his client's assets and liabilities. Fletcher paused. He does not know about the Caldwell holdings. No one in Grant's world knows, Vivian said. I kept my grandmother's requirement, not one person. And that decision, Fletcher said, is going to be the most expensive mistake Grant Mercer ever made. Njibemst. He placed a folder on the table. Inside were documents she had not seen before. He walked her through them quietly. The car, retitled in Grant's name only, 14 months ago, while she was 8 months pregnant with their first child. While she was grateful and tired and trusting and not paying attention to car titles. The joint savings account. $40,000 transferred in 3 separate withdrawals to an account she had not known existed. The second mortgage, Fenwick Drive, executed 7 months ago using a notarized signature that was not hers. Vivian looked at the mortgage document. She looked at the signature on the bottom line. Her name, her handwriting, almost, not quite. The notary, she said, is cooperating with us, Fletcher said. Grant paid him $300. The man has since developed a conscience. She set the document down. She picked up her coffee. She held it in both hands and looked at the kitchen window and the morning light coming through the glass and the azaleas along the front walk, still wet from last night's dew. God, she thought, I was so trusting. She stopped herself. Not trusting. That wasn't the right word. Trusting was not the failure here. He exploited the difference between trust and naivety, and she had given him the opportunity. But she was not foolish. She was not weak. She had been doing exactly what Agnes taught her to do. She had been watching. She had collected, without consciously meaning to, 4 years of observations. Small inconsistencies. The Charleston trip. The soap that wasn't his brand. The locked phone. The way he stopped asking about her day. The way he started managing her access to their accounts by explaining, patiently, that he was handling the financial complexity so she wouldn't have to worry. She hadn't worried. She had paid attention. 3 weeks ago, she had found the credit card statement. Not by snooping. He had left it on the kitchen counter under a bag of groceries. She had moved the bag, and there it was. A hotel in Charleston. 4 days. Dates that matched his conference exactly. She had looked up the hotel. She had seen the couple's packages, the champagne delivery, the sunset sailing charter for 2. She had called Dot. How long have you known? She had asked. 6 months, Dot said. I wanted you to find out in your own time. The girl? Her name is Brianna Lowe. She is 27. She works at his firm. Vivian had sat with that information for 3 weeks. She had not confronted him. She had not changed her behavior in any way he would notice. She had made his dinners and done his laundry and driven him to the airport and put a note in his toiletry bag. She had been watching. She was done watching. Tell me the timeline, she said to Fletcher. He walked her through it. 18 days to prepare. They would not seek a continuance. They would not give Grant any signal that she was ready for him. They would let him believe, for 18 more days, that this was going exactly to plan. Vivian listened. She nodded. She asked 3 precise questions, and Fletcher answered all 3 without hesitation. When he finished, she said, he offered to have papers served to me while I was lying on an examination table. 33 weeks pregnant. He chose that moment deliberately. Yes, Fletcher said. He thought it would break something in me, she said. He thought that was the right moment to make me feel powerless. Fletcher said nothing. He waited. I want him to see me in that courtroom, she said. 34 weeks pregnant. Standing in front of Judge Odom. I want that to be the moment he understands what he chose to do. She set down her coffee cup. Not before. Not a single warning before that moment. Fletcher looked at her for a long moment. He had known this woman since she was 19 years old. He had watched Agnes shape her with patience and intention and love. He had always believed that when the moment came, Vivian Caldwell would be ready. He picked up his pen. "Then we begin," he said. That same evening, 40 minutes north, Grant Mercer was at dinner at Oleander. He had ordered the Barolo. He had ordered the sea bass for Brianna because she always ordered the sea bass when someone else was paying, and he liked knowing what she would want before she said it. He liked knowing things. He liked being the one who understood the situation. "You're really doing this," Brianna said. She reached across the table. Her fingers were warm on his wrist. "Already done," he said. "Filed 4 days ago." She smiled. He watched her smile and thought about the next 6 months, about Fenwick Drive, and what the realtor had estimated, about the savings he had moved, about the modest support payment that his attorney had drafted, reasonable and unremarkable, the kind of settlement a woman with no resources would have no choice but to accept. He thought about Vivian. He thought about her the way he had been thinking about her for the last year, as an obstacle, as a problem with a solution, as a woman who had served a purpose and whose purpose was now complete. He did not think about the cedar box in the back of her closet. He did not know about the cedar box. He did not know about the photographs inside it, or the key on the silver chain, or the woman in those photographs who had built something that would outlast every man who had ever underestimated her. He did not know about the Caldwell name. He raised his glass. "I'm not crazy," Vivian thought, across the city in Dot's kitchen, with Fletcher's legal pad in front of her. "I know exactly what he is doing, and I know exactly what I have." She picked up her pen. She began to write. The cedar box smelled like her mother. That was the first thing. Every time Vivian opened it, even now, even 30 years after the accident that took her parents on a Tuesday morning in November, the smell hit her first, cedar and something floral. Her mother's perfume, transferred to the wood over years of proximity, permanent now in a way her mother was not. Vivian sat on the edge of the guest room bed at Dot's house with the box open in her lap. She had brought it from Fenwick Drive the morning after the papers were served. She had packed a bag, quietly and methodically, while Grant was at the office. She had taken her important documents, her grandmother's letters, her personal jewelry. The hospital bag she had packed 3 weeks earlier was already in the car. She had taken the cedar box last, holding it with both hands, and she had looked around the bedroom they had shared for 4 years. She had not felt grief standing in that room. She had felt something closer to clarity. She had turned off the light and left. Now she opened the box. The photographs were inside, same as always. Her grandmother Agnes at 40, standing in front of the original Caldwell Properties building on Commerce Street, shoulders back, chin level. The posture of a woman who had built that building from nothing and wanted the camera to understand that. Agnes at 50, shaking hands with 3 senators at a function in Washington. She was smiling, but her eyes were assessing. Agnes's eyes were always assessing. Agnes at 70, sitting across from a 20-year-old Vivian at the kitchen table in this house, handing her a single key on a silver chain. Vivian remembered the weight of the key in her palm. The silver was warm from Agnes's hand. "This is yours when you are ready," Agnes had said. "Don't be in a hurry. The best power is the kind no one suspects you have." Vivian had been 20 years old. She had not fully understood. She had accepted the key and worn it on the chain under her shirt for 3 years before she fully understood what Agnes was teaching her. "Power is not loud," Agnes said once. Loud is what people perform when they don't have enough of the real thing. Vivienne looked at the photograph of her grandmother at 40. Strong hands, unhurried expression, the absolute stillness of a woman with nothing to prove to the camera. She thought about Grant at dinner parties, Grant in restaurants, Grant talking to his colleagues about his wife. Grant's voice, when he said she had no ambitions, said it with warmth and approval. The way you describe a retriever who doesn't bite. God, she thought, he never saw me. Not once. Not even once did he look at her and wonder. Not once did he question why a woman of her intelligence and composure had never pushed back. Not once did he ask about the family trust in any serious way. He had accepted the number she gave him, modest, believable, the kind of number that explained the down payment without raising questions. And he had filed it away and moved on. He had not been curious. Curious men were dangerous to a secret. Incurious men were the safest keepers of things they didn't know they were keeping. She began to reorganize the cedar box. This was what she did when her mind needed to settle. Not the kitchen drawers. She wasn't home. But the box served the same purpose. Every photograph in chronological order, every document flat and uncreased, every letter sorted by date and placed with its envelope. It took 40 minutes. When she finished, the box was perfect. Her mind was clear. She thought about the morning he had called her low maintenance. She had been sitting 3 seats away at that dinner table, and she had heard him say it, and she had felt the specific interior sensation of choosing not to respond, of deciding that this moment was not the moment, of folding the feeling away and reaching for the breadbasket. She had done that so many times. She had folded so many things away. The anger, she realized, sitting in the yellow wallpapered guest room with her grandmother's photographs in her lap, was not new. The anger had been there for a long time. She had just been keeping it in a cedar box of its own, organized, dated, stored safely until the moment she was ready to open it. She was ready now. She put the photographs back. She closed the box. She placed it on the nightstand and lay back on the quilt and put both hands on her belly. "Eleanor," she said softly, "that's your name, Eleanor Agnes, after the woman who taught me everything that matters." Her daughter moved, a slow rolling shift, then a small kick, precise, deliberate. "She'll love you," Vivienne said. "She already does. She cried when I told her about you. I've only seen your great-grandmother cry twice in my life. That was the second time." She lay in the quiet for a while. Then she picked up her phone and emailed Fletcher. "What is our first move?" He replied in 4 minutes. "We let him think he is winning. For exactly 16 more days." She put the phone down and slept. Sutton Ames arrived the next day at noon. She came through the back door of Dot's house carrying 3 containers of soup from the Italian place on Meridian, a tote bag full of magazines, and the expression of a woman who had been furious on someone else's behalf for approximately 20 hours and needed somewhere to put it. She set the soup on the counter. She turned around. She looked at Vivienne sitting at the kitchen table. She crossed the kitchen in 5 steps and hugged her. She held on for a long time. She didn't say anything. She just held on. When she finally stepped back, her eyes were bright and her jaw was set, and she said, "I never liked him. I want you to know I have been biting my tongue for 4 years. 4 years, Vivienne. I once watched him introduce you to his firm's managing partner as, 'My wife, she doesn't work,' and I nearly—" "Sutton, I am just saying, I have a very long list. Does the list include the dinner at Davis's house, when he said I was low maintenance?" Sutton's eyes went wide. He said that in front of the entire table. 3 partners from his firm. Their wives, all of them, and you passed the breadbasket like he had told them your hair color. She shook her head. You are the most patient woman I have ever encountered in my entire life. My grandmother raised me to be. Grandma Agnes, Sutton said reverently, was absolutely right about everything. Vivian smiled. It was the first time she had smiled in 3 days, and it felt strange, and then it felt good, and she let it stay. They ate the soup. Dot joined them at the table, and the three women talked, the way they had talked in this kitchen since Sutton was 22, and Vivian had brought her home for a weekend, and she had never fully left. They talked about small things, about the azaleas needing water, about a film Sutton had seen, about the name Vivian had chosen. Eleanor Agnes, Dot said softly. She looked at her coffee cup for a moment. Your grandmother is going to... She knows, Vivian said. I called her last week. A silence settled over the table, warm and full. She said, Vivian continued, go show him what a Caldwell woman does when she is cornered. Sutton pointed at her with her spoon. I would like that on a bumper sticker. After lunch, Sutton leaned forward with her elbows on the table. She looked at Vivian with the specific directness she had always been capable of, the quality that had made her Vivian's closest friend since college, the quality that had made Grant vaguely uncomfortable every time Sutton was in the room. He had known, on some animal level, that Sutton saw him clearly. Tell me what you need, Sutton said. Vivian looked at her. I need you to be in that courtroom, not to testify, just to be there. Why? Because Grant is going to walk in expecting me to be alone. He has spent 4 years gradually narrowing my circle, limiting my social engagements, making subtle comments about people I was close to. He is going to expect me to walk into that courtroom by myself, she paused. I want him to see that I am not alone. Sutton reached across the table and took her hand. Vivian Caldwell, she said. She used the maiden name deliberately. You have never been alone, not for one single day. The document was 12 pages long. Fletcher placed it on the kitchen table at 9 in the morning, on day 4 of preparation. He placed it beside Vivian's coffee and waited while she read it. She read slowly. She turned each page with care. She did not speak until she had read the last line. Then she set it down and said, he moved $40,000 in 3 transfers. Over 5 months, Fletcher said. Small enough amounts that they wouldn't trigger an automatic flag. Large enough to be meaningful. And the mortgage. The forged application is dated 7 months ago. You were 26 weeks pregnant. Fletcher's voice did not change. He delivered information the way a surgeon described a procedure. Precise. Without editorial. The notary has provided a sworn affidavit. He was paid $300. $300, Vivian repeated. Grant believed the risk was minimal, Fletcher said. He believed you would not look. He believed if you did look, you would not understand what you were seeing. And he believed if you understood, you would have no resources to respond. 3 assumptions, Vivian thought, every one of them wrong. She looked at the forgery document, at the signature that was almost hers. Someone had practiced it, had sat somewhere with a pen and a piece of paper and had practiced her signature until it was close enough to pass a notary who wasn't paying attention and was $300 richer. The cold anger moved through her like water finding a crack in stone. I was being managed, she thought. From the beginning, he saw a woman with modest money and good manners, and he decided she was manageable. He decided she was a resource. He married her and moved her into a house and waited until she was pregnant, and then he started quietly, methodically, dismantling anything she might use to protect herself. I deserved better than this, she thought. That is not bitterness. That is just true. Add the forgery to the brief, she said. Already done, Fletcher said. There is one more thing. He placed a second folder on the table. She opened it. Inside was a financial summary of Grant's firm, his personal accounts, his salary history, his actual savings, as opposed to the savings he had led her to believe existed. She read the numbers. She was quiet for a long time. He's leveraged, she said, significantly. He has been managing cash flow problems at the firm for 8 months. Certain clients have been told their portfolios are repositioning. They are not repositioning. He needed the Fenwick Drive equity to cover. Fletcher paused. His entire plan depended on you having no independent resources. The restraining order was designed to establish you as unstable and unfit. A quick divorce settlement with you accepting a modest support payment. He walks away with the house equity, the hidden savings, and a clean narrative. And Brianna, Vivian said. She believes you have been separated for over a year, Fletcher said. She believes you were the one who left. Vivian sat with that for a moment. She thought about a 27-year-old woman who believed she was building something new, who had been fed a story that made her the good ending instead of the other woman, who thought she had won something. She had not won anything. She had been used. Vivian almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The sympathy was real, but it was quiet, and it did not interfere with anything she needed to do. There is something else, Fletcher said. His voice shifted very slightly, just enough that she noticed. A woman called my office yesterday. Her name is Patricia Lowe. She is Brianna Lowe's mother. Vivian looked up. She found my name in the public court records. She says her daughter does not know the full truth of the situation. She says if her daughter knew, she would not be with this man. Fletcher placed his pen on the legal pad. She asked whether you would be willing to speak with Brianna after the hearing. Vivian was quiet for a long moment. She thought about what Agnes had told her once, at the end of a very long conversation about the men who had tried to take pieces of the Caldwell empire over the decades. Agnes had said, "The women are almost never the enemy. The women are almost always just the next person in line he decided to use." "Tell Patricia Lowe," Vivian said, "that I will call after the hearing." Fletcher nodded. He made a note. They worked through the afternoon. By 4 o'clock, the brief was 400 pages. Fletcher had organized it into sections with the precision of a man who understood that the story a document told was as important as the facts inside it. Each section built on the last. Each piece of evidence connected to the next with the quiet inevitability of water flowing downhill. When they finished, Vivian sat back in her chair and looked at the stack of papers on the table. This is 4 years of my life, she thought. This is what a man who thought I was nothing built. And this is what I built quietly, underneath it, waiting for the right moment. She put her hand on her belly. Her daughter stirred. "We're almost ready," she said. She meant it for Eleanor. She said it to herself, too. She was almost ready. 13 more days. The fan ran all night. It was a white noise fan, the kind Dot kept in every bedroom because she believed in the sleep benefits, with the conviction of a woman who had raised 3 children and knew the value of silence by the time she was 30. The fan ran, and the guest room was dark, except for the thin line of light under the door. From the hall, night light, and Vivian lay on her back on the quilt with both hands on her belly. She was awake. Eleanor was awake too. Small movements, heel to ribs, the way she did when she could not settle. A restless signal that Vivian had learned to read over the past 8 weeks. When Eleanor was awake, Vivian was awake. They were already calibrated to each other, already a system. "I know," Vivian said softly. Me too. The fan ran. A car passed outside on the road, and the headlights swept across the ceiling and disappeared. 2 in the morning, 9 days before the hearing. This is the part they do not tell you about, Vivian thought. She meant the strength, the strategy, the 400-page legal brief, and the lawyer who had been waiting 23 years to use it, and the aunt who opened the door before you reached the porch, and the best friend who drove 40 minutes to bring you soup and hold your hand. All of that was real. All of that was waiting for her on the other side of 9 days. But this was also real. 2 in the morning, a dark room, a fan running, a baby awake against her ribs and missing something, not him. She had stopped missing Grant somewhere around the 3rd week after the Charleston discovery. What she had grieved was the idea, the marriage she had believed she was building, the Tuesday evenings and the Sunday breakfasts and the small shared rituals that had felt like a life and had been, she now understood, a very sophisticated performance. She had fallen in love with a man who did not exist. She had loved him faithfully for 4 years. And the hardest part was not finding out the truth. The hardest part was admitting she had sensed the gap between the man and the performance from the beginning and had chosen, deliberately and with full awareness, to love the performance anyway. The hardest part is admitting I knew all along. She held that. She did not push it away. She had pushed it away for a long time, and it had not gotten smaller from being pushed. She knew. She knew the night he came home from Charleston, smelling like hotel soap that was not their brand. She knew when he started tilting his phone away from her without thinking. She knew in her body, in the specific quiet of a woman who has been paying attention, even when her mind was working very hard to find alternate explanations. She made excuses for a long time. She reorganized the kitchen drawers and told herself she was being paranoid. She baked things at 10 at night and told herself she was nesting. She checked her phone at 2 in the morning and told herself she was just awake. I was afraid, she thought. That is the true thing. I was afraid to know because I was 8 months pregnant, and I did not know how to be afraid and pregnant at the same time and still function. But you can be both. She knew that now. You can be afraid and pregnant and still functional. You can be 33 weeks along and have a restraining order served to you on an examination table and fold it into your purse and ask about your next appointment without your voice shaking. You can be terrified and still show up. She picked up her phone from the nightstand. She opened the browser. She searched newborn sleep schedules. She read 3 articles. She saved one. She searched what to pack in a hospital bag. She had packed the hospital bag 3 weeks ago. She knew what was in it. She read the list anyway, 3 times. She moved to a different article. She read about swaddling techniques. She read about skin-to-skin contact in the first hour. She read about the specific kind of tiredness that follows birth, different from all other tiredness, and what helps. She was not reading for information. She was visiting the world where none of this darkness existed. The world of tiny onesies and hospital bag checklists and swaddling tutorials, where the only problems were logistical and the only unknowns were manageable, and her daughter was the whole horizon. She read for 40 minutes. When she put the phone down, her breathing had slowed. Her hands on her belly were steady. The door opened very quietly. Dot stood in the doorway in her robe, pale blue, worn soft with washing. She had silver hair, cut close to her head, and the posture, even at 2 in the morning, of a woman who stood straight out of habit, so old it had become structural. She looked at Vivian. She did not say anything. She came in. She sat on the edge of the bed. She picked up the brush from the nightstand, the same brush she had kept in this room for 30 years, and she began to brush Vivian's hair, the way she had done when Vivian was 7 years old, the year her parents died, and Dot became everything. They did not talk. The fan ran. Outside, a dog barked twice and went quiet. The brush moved slowly. Vivian's eyes grew heavy. Dot left the lamp on when she left. In the morning, the sun came through the yellow curtains, and the room was gold and warm, and Vivian woke up slowly. Surfacing from the best sleep she had managed in 2 weeks, she lay there for a moment, just breathing. Then she sat up and reached for her phone and opened the email thread with Fletcher. He had sent a message at 6:45 in the morning. He had attached a revised section of the brief. He had also sent a one-line note. "She is going to be wonderful." He meant Eleanor. He had known she was pregnant before she told him. He had been her grandmother's attorney for 23 years, and he knew the Caldwell women, and he knew what they were capable of, and he had been waiting, in his precise and unhurried way, for this particular morning. Vivian replied, "She already is." Then she got up and went to find Dot and coffee and the next 8 days of preparation. In the afternoon, Fletcher called with news. "Nolan Voss reached out this morning," he said. "Pre-hearing settlement offer. Tell me, the car, $3,000 per month in support." He framed it as generous. Vivian looked out Dot's kitchen window at the azalea bushes. They needed water. She would water them this evening. "He offered me the car," she said, "that Grant retitled in his own name without my knowledge. Yes. And $3,000 a month. He said to communicate it to my client as soon as possible. The implication was that you would be grateful." Vivian was quiet for a moment. She thought about Nolan Voss. 22 years in family law, a man given a simple case, a straightforward divorce, stay-at-home wife, modest assets. A client with a restraining order already filed. He did not know what was in the 400-page brief. He did not know what was in the sealed envelope marked Caldwell Global Holdings. Asset disclosure that Fletcher had prepared for filing. He did not know what he was walking into. "Good. Tell Nolan Voss," Vivian said, "that you will communicate the offer to your client and respond before the hearing." She paused. "Do not respond before the hearing," she said. "Of course not," Fletcher said. Rain came in the evening. It tapped against the kitchen windows at Dot's house and made the outside world soft and close and the inside of the house warm by contrast. Sutton arrived at 6 with dinner. Chicken and roasted root vegetables with the herbs Vivian's mother had always used. The recipe that Dot had taught Sutton years ago, specifically for the occasions when Vivian needed it. They ate at the kitchen table, the three of them. They did not discuss the hearing. They talked about the crabapple tree in the backyard that needed pruning. They talked about a documentary Dot had been watching. They talked about a gift Sutton was bringing to a baby shower next weekend. For a college friend neither Vivian nor Dot knew particularly well, and Sutton described the gift with such specificity and warmth that they were all laughing by the end of it. The rain continued. The kitchen was warm. After dinner, Vivian got up and made tea and set 3 cups on the table, and they sat with their hands around the cups for a while. "Eleanor Agnes," Dot said. She had been thinking about it. "Your grandmother called me after you told her." "What did she say?" she said finally. Dot smiled. "Just that. Finally." I could hear her crying, but she said finally. Vivian looked at her tea. Agnes was 89 and not entirely well. The drive to the estate was 2 hours, and Vivian had not been able to make it in weeks. But they talked on the phone. Long conversations in the evenings, the kind of conversations where Agnes told stories from the early years of the company Stories Vivian had heard before but always wanted to hear again. Stories about the men who had underestimated her, about the lawyers who told her she couldn't, about the bankers who said women didn't understand leverage. Agnes had outlasted all of them. Vivian planned to be at the estate the week after the hearing. She planned to sit in Agnes's chair by the window and put Eleanor in her arms. She planned a lot of things for after. Sutton said, "What are you wearing tomorrow?" "Navy dress," Vivian said. "The one from Marchetti's. Simple. The pearl earrings Agnes gave me for my 25th birthday." Sutton nodded approvingly. "And your hair. Down. Good." Sutton wrapped both hands around her mug. "He always wanted you to wear it up. He said it was more professional." Vivian had not consciously made the connection, but it was true. Grant had a preference for her hair up. He said it was elegant. He said it was polished. He had a roster of small preferences she had accommodated over 4 years without examining why she accommodated them. Her hair would be down tomorrow. After Sutton left and Dot had gone to bed, Vivian moved through the house quietly. She turned off the kitchen light. She checked the back door. She looked at the hospital bag by the front door, already packed and ready. She went to the guest room. She unzipped the garment bag on the back of the door and looked at the navy dress. Then she looked at the tiny white onesie she had placed on the dresser. Yellow ducks. Eleanor's first outfit, folded and waiting. The dress for tomorrow. The onesie for after, who she was in the morning, who she would be caring for immediately after. The same woman, she thought, both at once. Always. She got into bed. She arranged the pillows the way she needed now, one behind her back and one between her knees. She put her hand on her belly. "Tomorrow," she said to Eleanor, "tomorrow I go, and then it's almost time for you." She closed her eyes. She slept. In the morning, 6:45, she woke before the alarm. She lay still for a moment. She listened to the house. The rain had stopped. Birds outside. The refrigerator hummed from the kitchen. She checked her phone. 3 times. Lock, unlock, lock, unlock. She held it a moment. Then she set it down. Not because she was dreading anything, because there was a small, stubborn part of her that half expected something, some signal from Grant that he had figured it out, some call from a number she didn't recognize, some vibration of the world shifting on its axis. Her phone was quiet. At 7:45, it buzzed once. She picked it up. A text from Grant's number. "I hope you will be reasonable today." She looked at the text for a moment. Reasonable. She put the phone in her purse. She went to find Dot. She ate half a piece of toast because her appetite had been unreliable at 34 weeks, and this morning was not the morning to push it. She drank 1 cup of coffee, half strength, the way she had been drinking it for months. She stood at Dot's kitchen counter and looked through the window at the backyard and the crabapple tree and the gray morning light. Reasonable, she thought again. He had not changed at all. Even now, this morning, with everything about to crack open, he was still writing texts that assumed she was waiting to be told what to be, that she was an object with a dial, that the right word from him would turn the dial to the correct setting. Reasonable, low maintenance, easy. Not once, not even once. She straightened her shoulders. She picked up her briefcase. She went to find Dot in the car and the morning. It was time. The bailiff's voice echoed. "All rise." The courthouse was old, granite, with high ceilings and long corridors, and the particular echo of a building designed to make individuals feel small, inside something larger and more permanent than themselves. Vivian walked the main corridor, with Fletcher on her left and Dot on her right, and the sound of her heels on the marble was steady and unhurried, and she kept her eyes forward. She could feel the courthouse around her, the smell of it, old stone and paper and something metallic in the recycled air, the sound of other cases in other rooms, voices through walls, the occasional burst of static from a security radio. She was 34 weeks pregnant, and she had slept well, and her hair was down, and she was wearing her grandmother's pearls, and she had never in her life felt more completely herself. Grant arrived at the courthouse at 8:50. She did not see this. Fletcher had positioned her in a separate waiting area at the end of the east corridor, away from the main entrance. But she would learn the details later from Sutton, who had arrived early and taken a seat in the gallery with a clear sight line to both doors. He looked like a man going to an interview, Sutton would say later. Charcoal suit, fresh haircut. He walked in with Nolan Voss and shook his hand in the hallway and scanned the entrance and did not see her. He looked confident, settled, the expression of a man who had decided how the story ended and was arriving to watch it conclude on schedule. Nolan Voss received the envelope at 8:57. Fletcher had timed it precisely. A paralegal from his firm arrived at 8:56 and handed the sealed envelope directly to Nolan Voss in the main corridor. The envelope contained the Caldwell Global Holdings asset disclosure, the complete financial documentation, the mortgage fraud evidence, the forged signature affidavit from the notary, and a cover letter from Fletcher that was 3 sentences long and professionally devastating. Vivian was not there to see Nolan Voss open the envelope, but Sutton was in the gallery, and she watched the hallway through the glass, and she watched Nolan Voss read the cover page and then stop and read it again. She watched him put his hand on Grant's arm and pull him toward the wall. She watched Grant's face. Later she would say, he looked like a man who had just understood, for the first time, that the floor was not where he thought it was. In the east corridor waiting area, Vivian sat in a wooden chair with her briefcase on the floor beside her and her hands folded in her lap. Fletcher sat beside her. Dot sat on her other side. Fletcher said, Nolan Voss has the disclosure. Yes, Vivian said. Are you ready? She thought about a parking garage and a pigeon walking on a concrete barrier. She thought about a cedar box and a key on a silver chain and an 89-year-old woman saying, go show him what a Caldwell woman does when she is cornered. Yes, she said. I'm ready. The courtroom was high-ceilinged and wood-paneled, with 3 long benches in the gallery and 2 tables at the front. The respondent's table was on the right. Fletcher pulled her chair back, and she settled into it carefully, the way she moved everywhere now, with the deliberateness of a woman managing an additional 34 weeks of weight and presence. She did not look at Grant immediately. She took out her notepad. She arranged it on the table. She exchanged a quiet word with Fletcher about the sequencing of the documents. She aligned her pen. Then she turned. Grant was at the petitioner's table. He was looking at her. His face was the color of old paper. His hands, she noticed, were not visible on the table. They were in his lap, gripping something. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned back to Fletcher. 3 seconds was enough. Judge Harriet Odom entered at 10:03 precisely. She moved to the bench with the particular economy of a woman who had been doing this for 14 years and had learned to spend no motion unnecessarily. She was 68, silver-haired, bifocals on a beaded chain that she wore around her neck when she wasn't reading. She took her seat. She surveyed the room. She reviewed the documents in front of her for 4.5 minutes in complete silence. No one spoke. The courtroom held its breath. Judge Odom removed her bifocals and looked at Nolan Voss over the rims. Counselor, did you review the respondent's asset disclosure before this morning? Nolan Voss stood. He was a composed man normally. He did not look composed. I received it this morning, Your Honor. Given the complexity of the financial documentation included, I would request a continuance to allow adequate time for— Denied, Judge Odom said. She looked at Fletcher. The petitioner filed an emergency restraining order against a 34-week pregnant woman. The respondent elected not to seek a continuance. We proceed today. Grant made a sound. It was very quiet. Not a word. Just the sound a man makes when a door closes. The hearing took 3 hours and 11 minutes. Fletcher presented with the quiet, methodical precision of a man who understood that facts, arranged correctly, were their own argument. He did not editorialize. He did not raise his voice. He moved through the evidence with the unhurried certainty of a man who had been waiting for this particular morning for 23 years. The Caldwell Global Holdings documentation, decades of public filings, private records, and trust documentation establishing Vivian Rose Caldwell as the sole primary beneficiary and designated successor of an entity worth $36 billion. The property records showing that the Fenwick Drive down payment had been made entirely from the Caldwell Family Trust. The retitled car, the transferred savings, the forged mortgage application, the notary affidavit, the hidden bank account, each piece laid flat on the table of the courtroom like cards turned face up one at a time, each one quiet, each one permanent. At the 2-hour mark, Judge Odom called a 15-minute recess. Vivian walked slowly to the restroom. She ran cold water over her wrists. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror. Her mascara was perfect. Her posture was perfect. The pearl earrings caught the fluorescent light. Her face was resolved. That was the word. Not triumphant, not afraid. Resolved, like a chord played correctly, like a lock turned to the right combination, like a woman who had been waiting a very long time to be exactly where she was and who had arrived, finally, without apology. She dried her hands. She straightened the pearl earrings. She went back in. The second half of the hearing was quieter. Fletcher had finished presenting. Nolan Voss had called Grant to the stand, and Grant had answered questions with the specific flatness of a man whose script had been taken from him. He looked at the ceiling when he answered. He said, "I don't recall 3 times. He said I was advised twice." He did not look at Vivian. Judge Odom asked her question at the 2-hour, 50-minute mark. Her voice was level, almost conversational. The tone of a woman who already knew the answer and was asking for the record. "Mr. Mercer, given the asset documentation provided by Respondent's Counsel, which establishes that the Fenwick Drive property was purchased entirely with funds from Mrs. Mercer's family trust, on what grounds did you execute a second mortgage application bearing what has been identified as a forged version of your wife's signature?" Nolan Voss was on his feet. "Your Honor, I would advise my client— Your client," Judge Odom said, "will require counsel significantly more specialized than yourself for what comes next." She looked back at her documents. She ruled at 3:14 in the afternoon. The emergency restraining order was dismissed. Judge Odom used the word frivolous in her written notation. She stated for the record that the application appeared to represent a deliberate attempt to use the legal system as an instrument of financial and personal coercion against a vulnerable party. She referred the mortgage fraud evidence and the hidden financial transfers to the district attorney's office for review. She looked over her bifocals at Grant. "This court has seen a great many things," she said. "It has seldom seen a more transparent attempt to weaponize legal process against a woman in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy. I trust you understand the full implications of what has been presented here today." Grant understood. Nolan Voss had already begun to physically separate himself. He was still at the table, but he had shifted his chair back an inch, and his body was angled away, and he was making notes on his pad with the concentrated focus of a man who needed something to do with his hands. Vivian looked at Grant one more time. He was staring at the table. He looked smaller than he had this morning, not in any physical way, in the way of a performance that has run out of audience. She turned away. She did not look back. In the corridor outside the courtroom, the afternoon light came through the long windows in strips of gold and gray. Fletcher walked beside her. Dot took her arm. Sutton was already outside, standing at the top of the courthouse steps, and when she saw them come through the doors, her face did the thing that happens before social training catches up with feeling. They stood at the top of the steps for a moment, the four of them. No one said anything important. Dot found a tissue. Sutton made a sound that was part laugh and part something without a name. Fletcher loosened his tie. Vivian put her face up to the afternoon sun. Eleanor Agnes, she thought. Your mother showed up. I need you to know that, wherever you are right now in your warm, dark world. Your mother showed up, and she did not flinch, and she did not apologize, and she did not make herself smaller. She raised her face to the sun and breathed. 2 days after the hearing. The morning was cool and bright, and Dot's backyard was full of the specific quality of early fall light that made everything look preserved. The azalea bushes had been watered. The crabapple tree threw a long shadow across the grass. Vivian sat at the kitchen table with her phone in front of her and a cup of tea and the number Patricia Lowe had left with Fletcher's office. She had thought about this call for 2 days. She had thought about what it meant to call the mother of a woman who had been sleeping with your husband. She had examined the feeling for anger and found, to her own slight surprise, that the anger had a different address. The anger lived at Grant's door. It had always lived at Grant's door. The woman he had chosen to use for his purposes was not the architect of what happened. She was just the next person in line. Vivian dialed the number. It rang twice. The voice that answered was not Patricia Lowe's. It was young, cautious, a young woman's voice with something careful in it, the specific carefulness of a person who has been rearranging a very large understanding of a situation and is still finding where the pieces land. I know who you are, Brianna Lowe said. My mother told me everything. I've been... She stopped. Started again. I didn't know. I want you to know that first. I didn't know about you, about the pregnancy. He told me you had been separated for over a year. He said you were the one who... She stopped again. He told me a lot of things. He told you what he needed to tell you, Vivian said. A silence. It was not hostile. It was the silence of two women on either side of the same man's lies, taking a moment to see each other across the distance he had put between them. I'm sorry, Brianna said. The words came out plain and direct, no performance in them, just a 27-year-old woman saying the true thing. Vivian thought about this for a moment. She thought about what Agnes had told her. The women are almost never the enemy. The women are almost always just the next person in line he decided to use. He lied to both of us, Vivian said, in different ways. For different reasons. I'm not interested in being angry at you. Why not? Because he already took enough of my energy. I am not giving him one more minute of it. A pause. He's been calling me, Brianna said. Since the hearing. He says it was all a misunderstanding, that you... She stopped. He's lying again, isn't he? Yes, Vivian said. I ended it, Brianna said. 3 days ago, the day after the hearing, my mother called me and told me what happened in that courtroom, and her voice shifted, steadied. I'm done. Vivian did not say good, or smart, or I'm glad. She said, That's your choice to make. I already made it, Brianna said. They talked for 11 more minutes. Nothing dramatic, nothing resolution-shaped. Just two women who had been lied to by the same man, finding the edges of the truth. Brianna asked one direct question about whether Vivian was all right. Vivian said yes, she was more than all right. She was about to have a daughter. Brianna said, "What's her name?" "Eleanor Agnes," Vivian said. A pause. "That's a strong name. She comes from strong women," Vivian said. When she hung up, she sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. She thought about the complicated web one man's dishonesty weaves, how it catches everyone nearby, how it leaves a residue on hands that never ask to touch it. She set the phone down. She thought about her grandmother, about the stories Agnes told of the men who had come for the Caldwell Empire over the decades. Competitors, lawyers, husbands of women who worked for her, men who thought she could be cornered, men who thought her politeness was weakness or her patience was ignorance, or her stillness was defeat. Every single one of them had been wrong. Agnes had outlasted them all by understanding something they did not. That real power does not announce itself. That the most dangerous thing a woman can be is the thing her opponent has decided she isn't. Vivian picked up her phone one more time and called her grandmother. Agnes answered on the second ring. Her voice was clear and deliberate, the way it had always been, age having taken nothing from its precision. "Well," Agnes said. "Tell me." Vivian told her, all of it. The courtroom, the judge's face, the word frivolous in the written ruling, the way Grant had looked at the table afterward. Agnes listened without speaking. When Vivian finished, there was a silence that lasted several seconds. Then Agnes made a sound, low and satisfied, the sound of a woman who has been waiting for something and has finally, after a long time, heard it arrive. "The dress," Agnes said. "Was it the navy one?" Vivian smiled. "Yes." "Good," Agnes said. "And the pearls?" "The pearls." "Good." A pause. "Come this weekend. Bring Eleanor's bag. I want to be there when she arrives." "Agnes," Vivian said gently, "Eleanor isn't due for—" "I know when she's due," Agnes said. "Come anyway. I want to see you." Vivian looked out the window at the azaleas. She thought about the 2-hour drive south, the estate house, the chair by the window where Agnes spent her afternoons, the specific quality of light in that house in the early evening. "I'll come Friday," she said. "Good," Agnes said. "And Vivian, yes?" Starting over is just another word for beginning. Her voice was warm and dry and completely certain. "Now start." After she hung up, Vivian sat for a long time at Dot's kitchen table. The morning had gone quiet. The light through the window was moving slightly as clouds passed. The azaleas nodded once in a small wind. She picked up her phone one last time. She opened a new note. She typed, "The prison door was unlocked the whole time." She looked at it. She saved it. She put the phone face down on the table. She was not thinking about Grant. She had not thought about Grant in the way of dreading him, of managing him, of waiting for the next thing he might do since the moment she walked out of that courtroom. He had collapsed inward. He was now a problem for a criminal defense attorney and a district attorney and whatever remained of his professional reputation after the firm finished its own investigation. He was not her problem. She was thinking about Eleanor, and she was thinking about Friday, and the drive south and Agnes in her chair, and the particular smell of the estate house, and the fact that her daughter would grow up knowing where she came from. Not the money, not the name on a building downtown, the women. The line of women who had been told they were nothing and had built something anyway. She was thinking about what she wanted her daughter to know when she was old enough to understand. She wanted her to know this. Patience is not the same as surrender. Waiting is not the same as losing. And the moment a person decides what you are, that is the moment you have the most power over them, because they stop watching, and you never stop. A cry split the silence at 4:17 in the morning, thin at first, reedy, like something testing its own existence, and then fuller, rounder, filling the room from wall to wall, filling the corridor, outside, filling the floor of the maternity ward, and traveling in both directions. The most determined sound Vivian had ever heard in her life. The nurse said, "She's here, she's perfect," and they placed Eleanor Agnes Caldwell on Vivian's chest. 7 pounds, 14 ounces, dark hair plastered flat. A face that had the compressed, ancient quality of the newly arrived, eyes squeezed shut against the light. Hands, perfect small hands, fingers opening and closing against the world they had just entered. And a grip. The nurse had warned her about the grip reflex. But when Eleanor's fingers found Vivian's and closed around them, the grip was so certain and so complete that Vivian made a sound she had not been prepared to make. A sound that came from somewhere below words. "Hey," Vivian said. Her voice was low and wrecked and entirely honest. "Hey you, there you are." Eleanor's face moved, not a smile, too early for smiles, but a shift, a settling, a recognition of the voice she had been hearing through water and warmth for 37 weeks. Dot was in the room. She stood at the foot of the bed with her hands pressed together and her eyes bright, and she was not speaking, which for Dot was the loudest possible declaration of feeling. Sutton was in the corridor. Vivian could hear her through the door. She was texting. Her phone was making the rapid tapping sound of a woman composing a message too fast to bother with autocorrect. Vivian found out later that she had texted Fletcher at 4:21 with the single word, perfect. And Fletcher, who was not given to expressive communication, had replied at 4:23, perfect. Vivian held her daughter in the blue-tinted stillness of the delivery room, and she breathed. She thought about the night she had lain in Dot's guest room at 2 in the morning, unable to sleep. She thought about the heartbeat monitor in Dr. Hollis's examination room. She thought about a manila envelope on a plastic chair. She thought about 14 pages that someone had spent time preparing, had filed with a court, had had delivered by a young man in a gray polo shirt who couldn't look her in the eye. She thought about the cedar box, about Agnes at 40 in front of a building, about a key on a silver chain pressed into a 20-year-old girl's hand. She thought about the courtroom, about standing at the respondent's table, 34 weeks pregnant, in a navy dress with her hair down. She thought about the word frivolous in a judge's written ruling. She looked at Eleanor. "You come from a long line of women who were told they were nothing," she thought. And every single one of them built something anyway. Every single one of them showed up. Every single one of them waited for the right moment and then walked through the door without apology. That is what you inherit. Not the $36 billion, not the buildings or the portfolio or the name on the filing. Those things matter, but they are not the inheritance. The inheritance is this. You do not make yourself smaller so that someone else can feel larger. You do not apologize for knowing what you know. You do not mistake patience for weakness or stillness for defeat. And when someone decides what you are, you let them. You smile. You pass the breadbasket. You bide your time. And then you walk into the room and you let them see what they missed. "Eleanor Agnes," Vivian said softly, "that is your name. You were named for the woman who taught me everything that matters." Eleanor's grip tightened. In the recovery room, an hour later, Sutton was finally allowed in. She came through the door and stopped in the middle of the floor and looked at Vivian holding Eleanor and her expression went through approximately 7 stages in about 3 seconds, and ended somewhere quiet and luminous. She sat on the edge of the chair beside the bed. She looked at Eleanor for a long time without speaking. This was unusual for Sutton. Sutton was the kind of person who filled silences on principle. Finally, she said, very quietly, "She has your chin." "She has Agnes's forehead," Vivian said. "God help anyone who underestimates her." Vivian looked at her daughter, at the compressed, perfect face, at the dark hair, at the hands that had already, in the first hour of existence, demonstrated their grip. "Nobody will," Vivian said. "Not twice." In the days that followed, the world reorganized itself. Fletcher called on day 2 with the first update. The district attorney's office had opened a formal investigation into the mortgage fraud. Grant's firm had placed him on administrative leave pending their own internal review. Nolan Voss had referred him to a criminal defense attorney, which was its own kind of verdict. On day 3, Sutton texted a single line. "He is staying with his mother." Vivian read this while nursing Eleanor at 3 in the morning in the quiet of the maternity ward. She thought about Cora Mercer, 64 years old, a woman who had spent 4 years calling her son's wife Grant's little housewife at cocktail parties, a woman who had looked at Vivian with the particular condescension of someone who has decided they understand a situation completely. Cora would now spend the foreseeable future explaining to her social circle why her son was under criminal investigation for fraud and what exactly he had been doing to the wife she had so confidently dismissed. Vivian put the phone down. She looked at Eleanor's face in the low light. She did not feel triumph. She had expected triumph to feel louder. It felt like this instead: a quiet room, a sleeping baby, 3 in the morning, and nothing to dread. Nothing to dread. She had been bracing for so long, since before the papers were served, since before Charleston and the credit card statement and the locked phone, since before she had consciously identified any of it. She had been operating with the low-grade vigilance of a woman kept waiting for the next thing, the next adjustment required, the next management of a situation that was always slightly unstable. The vigilance had stopped. She hadn't noticed it stopping until she noticed its absence. Like a sound you have lived with so long, you don't hear it anymore until one day it's gone, and the silence is so total it wakes you. She sat in that silence and held her daughter and breathed. In, out. The way you breathe when there is nothing to dread. On the 4th day, she moved back to the Fenwick Drive house. Fletcher had cleared it. The house was legally hers. Had always been legally hers. Grant had no claim, and his attorney, the criminal defense attorney now, not Nolan Voss, had advised him clearly against any approach to the property. She walked through the front door with Eleanor in the carrier, and Dot beside her, and Sutton behind them, both with 2 bags of groceries. The house smelled like her. It had always smelled like her. She had managed every room for 4 years, and it bore her imprint in ways she was only now seeing. The paint colors she had chosen, the rugs she had found. The kitchen organized the way her mind organized things, which was to say precisely and with intention. His absence felt like clearing. She walked through every room. She saved the bedroom for last. She stood in the doorway and looked at the room she had shared for 4 years with a man who had decided she was nothing. She looked at the walls and the furniture and the window that faced the backyard and the crabapple tree just visible through the glass. Then she turned around and went to the 2nd bedroom, Eleanor's room. She had painted it herself 2 months ago. Sage green, the color she had wanted since before she knew the baby's gender. It was warm and quiet, and the afternoon light came in at an angle that made the walls look like a garden. a white crib, a small chair for nighttime feedings, a mobile that Agnes had sent, hand-painted birds on silver wire. She unclipped the carrier and lifted Eleanor out and stood in the middle of the sage green room with her daughter against her chest. Here, she said, this is yours and mine, and this is where we begin. The drive to the Caldwell estate took 2 hours. Vivian had made it hundreds of times in her life, and she knew every section of it. The highway that narrowed to 2 lanes past the old mill town, the long curve along the river, the exit that was easy to miss if you didn't know it was there, a small green sign half hidden by the oak trees that had been growing in front of it since before she was born. She knew the road by feel. Eleanor slept in the car seat behind her for the entire drive, making the small sounds of a person deeply engaged with sleep, periodic small shifts, and the occasional sigh that carried more contentment per unit than anything Vivian had ever heard. She drove with the windows cracked. The air was cool and smelled like the particular combination of cut grass and river water that meant the estate was close. The smell that meant Agnes. The estate house was white, like Dot's house, but larger and older, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides and shutters that were painted the same dark green they had been painted since Agnes was a young woman. An oak tree, larger than anything, had a right to be stood in the front yard. The driveway was gravel, long and straight, lined by the boxwood hedges Agnes had planted in her 50s and which had grown, over 30 years, into walls of deep green on either side. Vivian parked. She sat for a moment in the quiet driveway. She looked at the house her grandmother had built. Not the building itself. The original estate had stood here, before Agnes, but everything inside it. The documentation of a 60-year enterprise, the evidence of a woman who had been told she couldn't and had proceeded anyway, with patience and intelligence and the specific kind of long vision that does not need immediate validation. She got Eleanor from the car seat. She carried her up the porch steps. The door opened before she knocked. Agnes Caldwell stood in the doorway. 89 years old, small now in the way that some people become small over time, not diminished, but concentrated, everything unnecessary gone. She wore her pearls. She wore them every day. She was leaning slightly on a cane she had acquired in the last year, and she wore the cane the way she wore everything, as though it were her idea and she had chosen it. She looked at Vivian, she looked at Eleanor, she did not move for a moment. Then she stepped back and held the door wide. Vivian walked into the house. The smell of it. She had forgotten and then remembered every time. Old wood and the particular wax Agnes's housekeeper had used for 30 years, and books, and the faint perpetual warmth of the kitchen, where something was always either baking or recently baked. Agnes led her to the sitting room, the chair by the window that faced the garden, and the old oak at the edge of the property, the oak older than the house, older than Agnes, older than anyone. Agnes sat in her chair. She set her cane against the arm. She looked at Eleanor with the focused attention of a woman who has trained herself over a lifetime to look at things exactly as they are. "Give her to me," Agnes said. Vivian sat on the low ottoman beside the chair. She transferred Eleanor into Agnes's arms. Eleanor opened her eyes. She looked at the light from the window. She looked at the face above her. She made a sound, not a cry, just an assessment. Agnes looked down at her great-granddaughter. She looked for a long time. Her face did not perform. It never did. What crossed it was real, and it was deep, and it was the face of a woman confronting the specific satisfaction of having built something that will continue. "She's a fighter," Agnes said. "She comes by it honestly," Vivian said. Agnes looked up. Her eyes were bright. "You were always a fighter," she said. You just had to wait until the moment was right. She paused. I know I asked you to wait a long time. You asked me to protect what was mine, Vivian said, until I was ready to use it. That's different from waiting. Agnes nodded. She looked at Eleanor again. The light from the window fell across them both, the 89-year-old woman and the 3-week-old baby, and the continuity of it was something Vivian felt in her chest, not as sentiment, but as weight. The real kind of weight, the kind that anchors you. What will you do now? Agnes asked. Vivian had been thinking about this question for 3 weeks. She had been thinking about it since the morning in the courthouse corridor when she had stood at the top of the steps with her face in the afternoon sun and understood that the next part of her life, her sharper part of her life, was not a recovery. It was a beginning. I want to learn the business, she said. Agnes went still, not surprised. Recognition, as if she had been waiting for this sentence and had spent years not saying, Are you ready yet? Finally, Agnes said. I was ready when you told me to be ready, Vivian said, after I found out what I was capable of. She said it plainly, without performance. The way you say a true thing, when you no longer need anyone to believe it, except yourself. She had been capable of receiving a restraining order on an examination table 33 weeks pregnant and not making a sound. She had been capable of 10 days of methodical preparation with a clear head and a focused fury, and the patience her grandmother had spent 60 years teaching her to trust. She had been capable of walking into a courtroom at 34 weeks, pregnant, in a navy dress, with her hair down and standing in front of a judge and a fraudulent husband and saying, with her posture and her presence and 400 pages of documentation, Here's what you missed. She had been capable of all of it. She had always been capable. Grant had given her the occasion to prove it. He thought he was burying me, she thought. He was planting me. Agnes looked at her for a long moment. Then she shifted Eleanor gently against her arm and reached out her free hand. Vivian took it. Agnes's hand was thin now, the bones close to the surface, but the grip was still certain. Monday, Agnes said. Fletcher will bring the company documentation. We start Monday. Monday, Vivian agreed. They sat together in the light from the window. The afternoon came in and moved across the floor the way it always had in this room, the way it would continue to move long after all of them were gone. The oak at the edge of the garden threw its long shadow toward the house. Eleanor slept in Agnes's arms. Later, when the light had gone amber and Dot had called to check the drive and Fletcher had sent a short email confirming Monday at 9, Vivian took Eleanor back from Agnes and settled her in the carrier and went to the back porch. She sat in the old wicker rocking chair she had sat in every summer of her childhood. The yard smelled like autumn, the specific smell of leaves beginning to release, of the year beginning its long turn inward. A bird called from the oak and fell silent. She held her phone. She looked at it. She set it on the armrest. She waited a moment. She did not pick it up again. There was no one she was dreading hearing from. There was no call she was waiting for with the coiled readiness of a woman managing potential damage. There was no text that could alter the shape of this afternoon or threaten the thing she was building, or take anything from the woman sitting on this porch in the amber light. She had stopped bracing. She hadn't noticed the exact moment it stopped. Somewhere between the courthouse steps and the recovery room, somewhere between Dot brushing her hair at 2 in the morning and Agnes saying, finally, in her precise and satisfied way. Somewhere in the accumulation of days in which the next blow did not come, because she had, at last, stepped out from under the place where the blows landed. This is what the other side feels like, she thought. Not triumph. Triumph was too loud for this. This was quieter. This was an afternoon and a sleeping baby and a yard full of amber light and the complete and total permission to simply exist in her own life without preparing for the worst. She had not known how much of her had been engaged in that preparation, how much intelligence and attention and energy she had spent every day on the management of a man who had decided what she was and stopped paying attention. All of that was available to her now. All of that would go somewhere else. She picked up her phone one final time and opened the note she had saved. The prison door was unlocked the whole time. She read it. She added a second line. I was just waiting for the right moment to walk out. She read both lines. She saved the note. She closed the phone. She set it face down on the armrest, and she did not pick it up again. Eleanor made a sound against her chest, not a cry. The small, satisfied sound of a sleeping baby adjusting to the world. The sound of a person who is warm and held and has not yet learned to brace for anything. Vivian put her hand on her daughter's back. She felt the steady rise and fall of her breathing. Steady. Strong. The same rhythm from the ultrasound room. The same rhythm that had filled the examination room that morning when a young man in a gray polo shirt had set an envelope on a plastic chair and said, "Have a good day," without looking at her face. The heartbeat that had continued while she read 14 pages in a paper gown in a room that smelled like antiseptic, that had continued while she sat in a parking garage watching a pigeon walk on concrete, that had continued through 18 days of preparation and 400 pages of documentation, and one afternoon in a courtroom where a judge called something frivolous, and a man's hands gripped the arms of a chair, still going, steady, strong. Everything Grant Mercer had thought he was going to take, she was holding in her arms. Everything he thought she had already exceeded. She sat on the porch of her grandmother's house in the amber light of a fall afternoon, and she breathed, in, out. She did not brace for anything. Agnes Caldwell had built an empire by understanding the difference between power that is performed and power that is real. She had passed that understanding to her granddaughter with patience and intention and a key on a silver chain and the word finally. Vivian Caldwell would pass it to Eleanor Agnes, and Eleanor Agnes, when the time came, would pass it further. That was the inheritance. That was the thing no one could take. The light held the yard. The oak threw its shadow. The bird called once more from the upper branches, and then the yard went quiet with the full and permanent quiet of a place that has been standing long enough to know that what matters endures. Vivian closed her eyes. She did not brace. She did not wait. She simply breathed and held her daughter and let the afternoon be exactly what it was. Closing editorial disclaimer. The content you just heard was carefully researched, independently written, and manually crafted by our editorial team, created with intention so that every story we tell carries real meaning, a real lesson, and something worth your time. If this story moved you, challenged you, or reminded you of your own strength, give it a like, drop a comment below, telling us what moment hit you hardest, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. New stories every week. Subscribe so you never miss one.